The desert winds carried whispers that the elders never spoke of aloud. Busa was a village caught between sand and sky, and secrets bloomed in its dust. When the council found Imani sitting quietly beneath the charred baobab tree, her hands folded in her lap, they saw no tears. Only silence. Her parents were gone, vanished without trace, no blood, no struggle, only their footprints fading into the dunes. Some called it a curse. Others said the wind had taken them. Imani was 6 when the council took her in. Each of the 5 elders agreed to watch over her, though none dared take full responsibility. They feared what might come with her name, with the girl who never cried, never screamed, never asked why. She only watched, her dark eyes always full of something the elders could not read. Some saw pain, others saw knowledge. A few saw reflection. She grew up under the gaze of the village. At the well, the other children whispered about her when they thought she couldn't hear. The ghost girl, they called her. The one who knows too much. When she walked, the wind seemed to part for her. When she sat near the cooking fires, they burned a little hotter. One child swore the flames danced to her breath. But Imani never reacted. Her silence was her weapon, her shield, and perhaps her curse. At 10 she began to spend more time near the graves. Not grieving, not mourning, observing. Her fingers would trail over the etched stones, sometimes lingering on names that no longer belonged to anyone still living. A gravekeeper once asked her if she missed her parents. She blinked once, slowly, then turned her face to the sky. The man never asked again. The council debated her fate every dry season. She should be sent to the hills, said Elder Matu once. There are people there who deal with children of the strange kind. But Elder Zuberi shook his head. She is ours. Whatever she is, she belongs to Busa. The strange thing was, despite their suspicion, the village prospered. The crops near where she sat grew faster. The rains came more often when she walked through the fields. A woman who had been barren for years conceived after sharing a piece of mango with Imani. The villagers began to watch her not with fear but with awe. But then came the salt. No one could trace the origin of the suggestion, but soon Imani's meals began to change. The cook at the council hut began adding a pinch of salt to everything. Then a spoon. Then whole handfuls. She ate without complaint. Even when the salt burned her lips or made her tongue crack. Even when her gums bled. For a full moon cycle she ate salted bread, salted millet, salted water. She never winced, never cried. And then on the 31st day she whispered a name. It came without warning. During the dawn gathering, as the council read blessings over the week's harvest, Imani rose to her feet and whispered, "Quail." A silence swept over the square. Elder Zuberi turned pale. "What did you say, child?" he asked, his voice unsteady. She said nothing more. She simply sat again, her eyes closed, her hands folded. Quail had been a merchant years ago. Vanished with a caravan that never reached the trade city. Some had suspected bandits. Others believed the desert swallowed them. But Quail's name had been buried, hushed up, wrapped in rumor and shame. 2 days later, Imani whispered another name, Inama. And Inama's daughter, long thought dead from fever, returned to the village barefoot, delirious but alive. She claimed a voice had spoken to her in her dreams, calling her home through smoke and sand. Imani never explained. But the names kept coming. One each day. She never said them aloud, only whispered, soft as wind, during dawn or dusk. The names belonged to those gone. Thieves, healers, betrayers, victims. The village had buried many stories. And now their silence was unraveling. With each name a truth emerged. A woman once accused of witchcraft was found innocent when the true culprit confessed in a sleepwalk state. A hidden affair between a council member and a servant was revealed when Imani whispered both their names during a rainstorm. The villagers were no longer afraid of her silence. They feared her words. Some began to keep their distance. Mothers pulled their children close when she passed. The council no longer met her gaze. But still they did nothing. Because every time she spoke, the village changed. Broke. Revealed. One night, Elder Matu died. Before dawn, Imani knelt by his hut and whispered his name. The sky turned red and the sand hissed. That morning, his journals were found beneath the floorboards, records of deals with slavers, stolen harvests, lies whispered into the ears of old kings. By 13, Imani had become something more than a girl. Some called her a prophet. Others a curse-given form. She still did not speak to the living. Only the dead. Or the nearly dead. Her presence in the sick ward cured 2 infants and killed a man hiding poison beneath his tongue. Then came the stormless season. No rain fell. The crops withered. The animals grew thin. And Imani said nothing. The council, desperate, tried to feed her honey instead of salt. Tried to bribe her with silks, gifts, sacred songs. But she sat silent in the middle of the square, her lips sealed, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Until, finally she stood. She walked through the market, past the graves, to the black baobab tree where she was found as a child. She placed her hand on its bark and whispered 3 names in quick succession. The ground shook. And then it rained. Art. Relentless. For 7 days. The village wept, danced, offered her gifts. But Imani did not return. Her hut remained empty. Her name was never spoken again. Yet sometimes, during salt harvest season, children say they hear a whisper in the breeze. A name. Always a name. And the sky listens. Imani sat cross-legged beneath the baobab tree at the edge of the village square, her eyes vacant yet observing everything. The sand-stained winds of Busa whirled around her, and the golden heat of the sun kissed her cracked skin. The villagers had grown accustomed to her silence, so much so that her quiet presence became part of the landscape, like a carved stone no one noticed anymore. But that silence had begun to unsettle the elders. The old ones on the council whispered that silence like hers was unnatural. The mute ones, they said behind half-shuttered doors, can hear spirits better. And in Busa, anything that walked with the unseen was feared. So they began a ritual that was not written in their scrolls, one that no one admitted to starting. At first it was small, slightly salted bread instead of fresh maize cakes, broths with added brine, dried meats instead of fruit. Salt purifies, one elder told a curious child. Salt binds the soul, said another. Soon, everything placed before Imani was laden with salt. Salted rice. Salted stew. Even her drinking water turned to saline tea brewed with herbs from bitter desert shrubs. She did not refuse it. She never spoke. Her silence was her shield and her defiance. But her body began to fail. Her lips, once soft and brown, turned white and flaky. Her skin peeled at the corners of her mouth. Her tongue, dry as papyrus, cracked painfully whenever she moved it, which she rarely did. Yet her eyes never pleaded. Her posture never begged. She swallowed each salted meal with the quiet dignity of someone who had already tasted much worse. The villagers began to talk. "She's being cleansed," said one. "She's cursed," muttered another. "She's holding something back. That silence is dangerous." One day, when a wandering herbalist arrived from the hills and asked to examine her, the elders denied him. "She is under our care," they said. "She must eat what we give. We are protecting the village." The herbalist frowned. "You're protecting yourselves from her." Imani sat on the steps of the abandoned watchtower, watching the man leave with his donkey cart. She had not seen her reflection in months, but she could feel the change. Her bones ached. Her muscles wilted. Her stomach churned after every meal. Still she said nothing. But the salt was changing more than her body. At night, when the winds grew strong and cold, Imani began to hear whispers in the silence. Low voices from the cracks in the stone walls, from the earth beneath her feet, from the wind brushing the leaves. Not words exactly, but names. Faint syllables like echoes of forgotten truths. At first she thought it was madness born of hunger and thirst. But every time she woke from a dreamless sleep, the names stayed with her. Jelani. Nafisa. Mo. Names she had never heard. Names the village had long buried. She traced them into the dust with a trembling finger. Then erased them before dawn. The more salt she consumed, the clearer the voices became. She began seeing flashes of faces when she blinked. Shadows moving in places where no people stood. And always the names. Over and over. As though her very soul was becoming a vessel. One evening, a girl around Imani's age offered her an unsalted fruit behind one of the granaries. A sweet guava stolen from the elder's private stock. Imani took it with shaking hands. Her lips touched the fruit, and her body seized. The sweetness was poison. Her body had forgotten what softness tasted like. She dropped to the ground, clutching her chest, breath ragged. The girl screamed and fled. Villagers rushed in. Some said she had tried to poison herself. Others said she had been cursed for rejecting the salt. The council decided more salt was needed. "She is not cleansed yet," the head elder said. "The evil still festers in her." So they began feeding her raw salt wrapped in dried leaves. Her stomach rebelled. Her tongue bled. Her gums swelled. Yet still, no words left her mouth. The children of the village began to avoid her. Even the goats flinched when she passed. Imani walked with a limp now. Her spine curved slightly forward. But her eyes still glowed with something sharp. Something dangerous. something ancient. On the 28th day of salted obedience, as the red sun dipped below the jagged cliffs, Imani lay curled in her corner of the old meeting hut. The sky turned gray. The wind picked up. The air smelled of coming rain. She closed her eyes and the names returned. But this time the voices were louder. Say us. Call us. Free us. Her tongue moved. Not in speech but in response. The pain in her mouth vanished for a brief second. And in that moment the truth became clear. They weren't feeding her salt to cleanse her. They were feeding her salt to seal something in. But the seal was cracking. That night, as lightning danced beyond the hills and the first drops of rain kissed the parched earth, Imani whispered her first word in years. It was not in any known language. It was a name. And the wind howled in answer. Each night, as the salt pressed deeper into Imani's flesh and the brine seemed to live inside her breath, she began to hear things. At first, the whispers were faint. Like wind brushing against a distant tent flap. Like footsteps on sand that had no prints. She would lie on the straw mat in the corner of the elder's hut, curled like a question mark, the bitterness of salt still thick on her tongue, and the voices would come. Soft, steady, relentless. They didn't speak in the way humans did, not with full sentences or clear commands. They murmured. Names mostly. Names she didn't recognize. Names that stretched across her sleep like cracks in stone. Names that flickered behind her eyes even after she woke. Names that made her breath hitch and her heart tighten like a coiled rope. At first she told herself they were dreams. Nightmares born of hunger and salt, dehydration and cruelty. But the names kept coming. And they weren't just foreign anymore. One night, as the moon carved silver lines across the thatch roof, she heard it. The name of the village's water-bearer, Omari. A quiet man, young, careful, who walked with a limp. The next morning Omari was missing. No one had seen him. His water gourd still hung in the tree. His shoes sat outside his home waiting. The village muttered. Perhaps he left in the night. Perhaps he wandered into the dunes. But Imani felt it deep in her marrow. He hadn't left willingly. And she had heard his name the night before. Another night, another name, Bako. The old woman who sold woven mats in the market. She'd once slapped Imani for stepping too close to her wares. The next morning Bako was found collapsed in her home, her mouth crusted white with salt. Then came Abani. Elder. Powerful. Respected. Imani had always feared the woman's gaze. It pierced like arrows. The dream came again, more forceful this time. The voice whispered, Abani, again and again until Imani sat up in the dark, trembling. She stared at the door of her hut. A strange heat pooled behind her eyes. When she woke, she learned Abani had fallen ill. Not with fever, but with silence. The woman could no longer speak. Her voice had vanished like water in the sun. She gestured wildly, tears in her eyes, but not a single sound escaped her throat. By now the villagers were uneasy. They began to glance at Imani with nervous eyes. She still didn't speak. Her body grew thinner, her eyes sharper. And though her lips were cracked and swollen, though her tongue had blistered from the salt, something in her presence began to shift. Animals avoided her. Dogs whimpered and backed away. Birds flew in circles above her hut, refusing to land. One morning a child dropped a clay bowl at her feet and apologized quickly. But Imani hadn't flinched. She only looked down, and the shards began to tremble. Not from any touch. Just from her gaze. When the village healer tried to place a charm outside her hut, the charm burned. A soft, slow burn that turned the dried herb packet to ash in seconds. And no wind blew that day. Imani didn't understand it herself. She didn't ask for the names. She didn't know what they meant or why the dreams were hers. All she knew was that every night they came. And every morning something changed in Busa. The villagers whispered. About the salt. About the silence. About her parents, who had also vanished without a trace. Some began to call her Mchai, the cursed. Others, in hushed voices, called her Mlinda, the watcher. The whispers spread like cracks in a clay pot. But the strangest thing of all was the sky. It changed too. Each night the dreams came, the clouds above Busa darkened, even when no storms had been forecasted by the elders. Thunder began to grumble low in the distance. Not angry. Not near. Just present. Watching. Listening. Waiting. One evening Imani walked to the edge of the village. She stood under the old baobab tree where her parents used to sit. The wind whipped her dress around her legs, and the sky overhead swirled with slow-moving clouds. She opened her mouth. Not to speak, but to breathe, to let the salt and silence and fear release through her lips. And when she did, the air shifted. The leaves stopped rustling. Even the insects fell silent. From her cracked tongue came no words. But the wind carried names again. Not her voice, yet somehow hers. Dozens. Maybe hundreds. Names that sent shivers across the sand. Names that stirred the bones buried beneath the village. The next day the old well cracked open. Fresh water poured out, but it tasted faintly of salt. Children found tiny clay dolls scattered around the market, each one bearing a different villager's face. No one knew who made them. No one claimed them. And above it all, Imani sat beneath the baobab, her eyes half closed, her fingers tracing symbols in the dirt she didn't know she knew. Symbols that glowed faintly before the wind swept them away. That night, the whispers didn't wait for sleep. They came in the twilight. Soft, layered, singing in forgotten tongues. They didn't frighten her anymore. She began to listen. Not just with her ears, but with the hollow in her chest where her childhood once lived. With the raw nerves of her tongue. With the memory of her mother's lullabies, half remembered and soaked in rain. And through the whispering storm inside her, she understood one thing. The names she heard weren't just random. They were memories, buried truths, wounds the village tried to forget. They fed her salt to silence her, to scrub the truth from her body. But the salt instead preserved it, locked it inside her tongue. And now the truth was leaking out. In names, in whispers, in wind. She didn't know what would come next, but something deep inside told her this was only the beginning. The village of Busa would soon remember what it tried to bury. And Imani, the silent girl, would be the one to make them listen. The 30 days had passed in unbearable silence. Imani sat in the center of the council hut, her body frail, her lips split at the corners from too much salt and too little water. Her eyes, though, had changed. Once wide and glassy with innocence, now they held something ancient, something coiled and patient, like the desert before a storm. The elders stood in a semicircle around her. They had summoned the entire village to witness what they believed would be a moment of divine reckoning, or vindication. To them the salt had worked. It had bled out the curse. It had broken her defiance. But none of them noticed that she hadn't resisted because she was weakened. She had been waiting. Children were held back by their mothers, their wide eyes peeking from behind cloth wraps. The drummers were silent. Even the birds that always chirped in the tamarind trees kept their distance. No breeze moved through the air. The sky hung thick with waiting. An elder stepped forward. His name was Kalum. His robes were deep maroon, heavy with gold thread, and the scent of camphor clung to him like a warning. He raised his carved staff and declared, "This girl has been purified by salt. She has been cleansed of secrets. If she carries any remnants of evil, let them now be revealed before us all." Imani raised her head. The crowd leaned in. It was the first time she had looked anyone in the eyes since the rituals began. Her lips parted. A dry, cracked tongue passed over them, tasting air instead of salt for the first time in weeks. Then she said it, not loud, not whispered, but clear. Abadil. Just one name. Silence. A cough came from somewhere in the crowd. Then a low, pained moan from behind the elders. Kalum turned. Elder Agilo had dropped to his knees. His cane clattered beside him. He clutched at his chest, gasping, his mouth opening in a strangled scream that never came. His eyes widened as if seeing something no one else could. His robes darkened with spreading wetness. Not blood, not urine. Something black and tar-like oozed from his chest as though his heart had melted from the inside. Then he collapsed face first in the dirt. Women screamed. Men stepped back. Children cried. Kalum barked orders to carry Agilo's body away, but no one moved. All eyes were on Imani, who had not flinched, not blinked. She simply stared forward, as if waiting for someone else to acknowledge what had just happened. The villagers whispered. Abadil. Abadil. That was a name they had not spoken in years. He had been a council member once, tall and respected. Known for his harsh punishments, his iron spine. But he had vanished, disappeared one night after rumors of dissent and sacrificial misdeeds surfaced. Some said he fled into the mountains. Others believed the council buried him in the black ground behind the shrine. Now Imani had spoken his name. And an elder had died. Kalum's face turned stony, but his eyes betrayed panic. He leaned toward Imani, voice trembling despite himself. "Where did you hear that name?" She didn't answer. "What do you know about Abadil?" Still she said nothing. Her eyes did not shift. "She's cursed," a woman cried from the crowd. The salt did nothing. "No," muttered a man. "She's not cursed. She's remembering what they tried to make us forget." A murmur rippled through the people. The air felt hotter. The sky darker. Imani blinked slowly. Something shimmered around her, like heat waves rising from the earth, except they pulsed from her body. Her skin glowed faintly, like sunlight beneath river water. Kalum raised his staff. This is a test from the gods. She must not be allowed to speak again. He lunged forward, staff raised high, but just as he brought it down toward her head, a loud crack split the air. The staff snapped in two before it touched her. Kalum was thrown back by an invisible force, landing in the dust, stunned and speechless. From the crowd a child gasped. "Did you see that? She didn't even move." An elder muttered, "This is no child. This is something else now." Two guards stepped forward hesitantly, but Imani stood, for the first time in days. Her knees wobbled, but her spine was straight. Her body had not yet recovered, but her spirit towered. Her eyes roamed the crowd, and people stepped aside instinctively, giving her space. No one dared stop her. She walked past Kalum, who scrambled backward like a snake confronted by fire. She didn't run. She didn't speak again. But every step she took away from the circle left a faint shimmer in the dust, a line of sparkling residue like ash from a lightning strike. People began murmuring among themselves. Some knelt as she passed, unsure if they were in the presence of a goddess, a ghost, or an avenger. Children hid behind their mothers' legs. Men dropped their gaze, unsure whether to feel shame or awe. That night, the skies cracked open. A thunderstorm arrived with no warning. No clouds had been seen in the sky all week, but now lightning danced in slow motion, striking the earth in the distance and vanishing before the thunder could roar. One bolt hit the very edge of the village wall and burned the name Abadil into the red clay. By morning, a group of old women gathered outside the council hut. They had seen things, dreamed things, known things, but were too afraid to speak. Now they were ready. One of them, Mama Adanma, stepped forward and said, "The girl did not kill Agilo. His own lies dragged him into the underworld. She only opened the gate." Kalum scoffed. "This is madness. Superstition." But the people weren't listening to him anymore. They were watching the girl. Imani stood on the far edge of the village, staring into the desert. The wind moved her dress gently. Her back was to the crowd, but her presence held them like gravity. The whispers would return. The names would come. And one by one, the buried truths would claw their way back through her tongue, salted or not. And next time she might speak more than one name. They thought salt would quiet her. The same salt they forced into her food now wrapped tightly around her face, bound in thick cloth soaked in brine. Her lips cracked anew beneath the sting, and her skin blistered where the coarse grains rubbed raw. They sat her in the center of the old meeting hut, surrounded by incense and muttering elders, their words shaking with fear more than faith. They chanted in voices that once held power, once silenced storms and stilled uprisings. But now their prayers quivered like dry leaves before a coming wind. Imani sat still, her eyes glassy. She looked neither at them nor past them, only inward as if seeing something none of them could. The fire in the pit before her snapped once, spitting out a burst of white smoke that smelled not of wood but of burning salt. An omen. One of the youngest elders, fingers trembling, reached toward her to tighten the cloth. He barely brushed her cheek when he screamed. His hand blistered immediately, turning red, then black as if plunged into boiling oil. He fell back with a cry, clutching it to his chest. The others staggered, gasping. Imani didn't move. Her eyes remained open, fixed, distant. Then a sound. Faint. Humming. Not from her mouth, not yet, but from the ground beneath their feet. It vibrated like a warning, like thunder below the earth. The candles around them began to tremble. One by one they went out. The cloth around Imani's mouth began to steam. At first they thought it was the fire's heat, but the fire was nearly out. Then one elder stepped close and the cloth hissed. It began to smoke. She opened her mouth. The cloth didn't fall away, it evaporated. Like mist in sunlight. It lifted into the air in wisps and threads, leaving only a thin film of salt on her skin. Then she spoke a name. Just one. Abealu. No one moved. The wind blew in through the cracks in the wall. Somewhere outside a dog began to howl. Then another. Then silence. Abealu, an elder seated on the far edge of the circle, suddenly stood. His face had turned pale. I did nothing, he stammered. I wasn't even on the council then. Liar, someone whispered. It wasn't Imani. It came from the shadows. He backed away, tripped, and fell. He scrambled to his feet and ran from the hut, not bothering to close the door. No one followed. No one dared. Imani turned her head slowly. Another elder stepped back, his mouth trembling. "You must stop," he said hoarsely. "These names, they carry old things. Dead things. You do not understand what you're awakening." Imani looked at him. Her tongue moved behind her teeth, slow and deliberate. He flinched. She spoke again. "Omoyani." A gasp came from outside. Then a long low wail. A woman's voice, shrill, aged, filled with pain. The voice of someone long buried. The elders began to retreat. One turned to leave and collapsed, clutching his chest. Another fell to his knees, murmuring a name none of them recognized, confessing something about a missing child from decades ago. Yet another elder began to weep without reason, whispering, "We thought it was Mercy, we thought she wouldn't remember." The salt, once their weapon, now turned on them. Bowls of it cracked. Stones soaked in brine shattered like glass. Even the soil outside began to crust white where they had buried it, where they thought secrets could sleep safely forever. Imani stood. No one stopped her. She stepped forward, barefoot, her feet silent on the wooden floor. Every step she took left a faint damp mark, not of water but of salt pulling itself from her skin. Her power had fermented in silence, like rot under a sealed lid. And now that lid was lifted. She passed an elder trying to crawl away and paused. Her hand reached down gently, not cruelly, and touched his shoulder. He convulsed. His mouth opened and out came a single name, one he hadn't spoken since he was a boy. His eyes widened as if surprised he remembered it at all. Then he fell still, his breath light and shallow, as if a weight he'd carried for too long had just been removed. Imani left the hut. Outside the village was quiet. Doors were barred, shutters closed. But they had all heard. The names. The cries. The silence that followed. Children peeked from under cloth curtains. Women covered their ears and prayed. Men gripped knives they knew would be useless. Imani walked alone through the main path and the wind followed her. Leaves blew away from her feet. Fires flickered low, bending slightly in her direction. She said no more names that night. But the villagers knew, each of them, that she could. And they feared what their own names might do if ever spoken aloud. Imani moved like smoke through the village, her bare feet brushing the ground without sound, her lips murmuring names that hadn't been spoken in decades. Each name carried weight, like a stone dropped into still water. It rippled through the past and disturbed what had long been buried. The villagers watched her from behind cracked shutters and trembling curtains. They no longer dared to whisper her name. Instead they called her the Salt Tongue under their breath, a bitter prayer and curse rolled into one. She stood outside the butcher's hut and whispered the name Kweku. The wind carried the syllables like a funeral song. Inside, the butcher dropped his knife as if burned, clutching his chest. Years ago, it had been Kweku who went missing after accusing the butcher of cheating widows. That accusation had vanished as swiftly as the boy did. Now, from beneath the floorboards of the butcher's hut, bones surfaced in the dirt like they had waited for her voice to wake them. Next, she wandered past the yam fields, the wide expanse where children used to play. She paused at a shallow bend in the earth and spoke again. "Ao." A scream erupted from the crowd gathered behind her. A woman fell to her knees, sobbing, confessing to a crime no one had asked about. "He was my brother's son," she wept. "He saw too much." The earth began to swell. Something was coming up from underneath, as though the land itself wanted to retch out the truths buried within it. Imani did not stop. Her hair, once dull and dry, now shimmered with salt like strands dipped in the sea. Her eyes looked ancient, older than any elder in the village. When she passed the well near the center of Busa, she didn't hesitate. She leaned close and whispered into its depths, and the water below turned cloudy, then red, then clear again. Moments later, the widow Olamide, who had drawn from that well for years, began choking in her home, clawing at her throat as if the truth was trying to climb out. She died before she could speak. But Imani didn't need her to. The well had already answered. Children hid behind their mothers. Men held onto charms and carvings as if wood and string could save them. The village priest stood trembling near the shrine, whispering pleas to ancestors who would no longer answer. He remembered how many blessings he'd sold, how many sins he'd buried under silence. And now the girl's voice was unburying them all. With each name spoken, a new truth surfaced. They were not just names, they were locked doors blasted open, forgotten graves cracked wide, bloodstains returning to stone. In the market square, a vendor began pulling her hair, screaming about a baby she once left in the tall grass after her lover cast her aside. The tall grass behind the river that had never been cut since. A group of boys ran there and found a tiny skull wrapped in faded cloth. A man who had long pretended to be blind began weeping actual tears. She saw me, he sobbed. I thought she couldn't speak. I thought I was safe. The village no longer knew where to run. Imani had become a storm with a voice. And they had fed her that voice themselves. For weeks they had salted her tongue, believing they were cleansing her. But salt does not purify lies, it preserves them. And now, every salted word she spoke came back rotten with truth. But amid the crumbling lies and terrified confessions, something else began to happen. A little girl followed Imani through the village, silent but wide-eyed. She looked up at the salt tongue not with fear but wonder. Then another child joined. Then 3. They did not flinch when Imani whispered. They did not run when graves cracked open. They listened. They wanted to know. And perhaps that was what scared the adults most. Not just that the truth had returned, but that the children were no longer afraid of it. By nightfall, the sky above Busa churned with storm clouds, though not a drop of rain fell. Instead, thunder rumbled low like a voice clearing its throat. Imani stood by the central tree, the oldest one in the village, where ancestors were once honored before the practice was quietly abandoned. She placed her palm on the bark and whispered a final name. This time no one recognized it. It was a name from before, older than the council, older than even the shrine. The ground shook softly. The leaves turned silver. A crack ran up the old tree, not breaking it, but revealing something inside. An old carving, forgotten, hidden behind layers of bark. A figure no one remembered. A name no one dared to speak. Imani looked at the villagers with those storm-washed eyes and said nothing else. She didn't need to. The silence now was louder than thunder. And somewhere beneath their feet, the village of Busa remembered everything it tried to forget. The village of Busa, once so proud in its silence, now trembled under the weight of the unspoken. The air itself had changed. No longer was it the dry stillness of desert winds and salted prayers. Now it pulsed with unease, soft echoes in the night, branches scraping like fingers against the elders' windows, the steady drip of brine from unseen sources. And it was in this suffocating tension that the elders began to hear their own names. It started as a whisper, barely distinguishable from the rustle of palm leaves. A name, stretched thin like smoke, would wind its way into an elder's ear in the dark hours before dawn. They would jolt upright, heart pounding, eyes scanning the room. But there would be no one there, just the echo of their name fading into the corners of their memory. By the third night, none of the elders slept. Elder Folarin was the first to crack. A man once praised for his iron will and cold logic, he now paced his hut like a caged jackal. His robes were soaked in sweat. His eyes darted to every shadow. They're coming, he muttered to no one. The ones we buried beneath lies. They walk now. They walk with her voice in their mouths. The others mocked him at first, called it fear, guilt, imagination. But deep inside they knew. Because they too had begun to hear the same thing. Their names, spoken in Imani's voice, but also layered with something older, something from beneath the earth. Elder Wura was next. She had long been the matron of memory in the village, keeper of records, the one who ensured traditions were upheld and names erased. One morning her hut was found open. Her sandals were still at the entrance. And there in the center of the village was the fire pit, cold and blackened. She was in it. Not burnt. Not harmed. Just sitting inside it, staring up at the sky, whispering her own name again and again. Wura. 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 Wura, asterisk. When they pulled her out, she screamed, not at them but at something none of them could see. She's in the salt, she cried, foaming at the mouth. She walks in the brine. She has no chains. By midday she was dead. Imani said nothing. She walked to the edge of the village and stood near the yam fields, where the dry soil once held the bones of truth. Her eyes were distant. Her lips moved but no sound came. And yet, every elder felt it. Another name leaving her tongue like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. Elder Jobin fell next. He had always been the most devout, always leading the salt rituals with a voice that quivered with righteousness. But one night, the villagers found him clawing at his ears, blood streaking down his neck. Make it stop, he moaned. She keeps saying it. Over and over and over. She says I gave the girl away. But I didn't. I didn't know. But they all knew. The silence had only masked their sins. Now the salt that had once been used to cleanse Imani began to corrode their flesh. Elder Adewale, who had administered the brine fast, woke to find salt crystals sprouting from his fingertips like fungus. They dug into his skin, splitting it open. His screams filled the air, but no one went to his hut. When they finally found him, His tongue had turned stiff and white, crusted in a hard sheath of salt. A single word was scratched into the dirt beside his body, liar. Villagers began locking their doors. Mothers clutched their children. No one trusted the council anymore. And Imani, still silent, still walking slowly through the streets, was no longer seen as cursed. She was a reckoning. She was the return of balance. Elder Dalu, the one who had argued for mercy once, began to weep each time he saw Imani. I told them, he would say, rocking back and forth. I said she was just a child. I told them to feed her fruit, not salt. But I didn't stop them, did I? I watched. I prayed and watched and did nothing. The day he spoke his own name aloud, the sky cracked with lightning, and the tree he stood under split in two. He was gone before his ashes settled. Now only two remained, Elder Kenna and Elder Bako, the cruelest, the most unrepentant. They had ordered the salt binding. They had insisted Imani was unnatural, a vessel of misfortune. They had feared her silence not because it hid danger, but because it hid truth. One morning, the villagers awoke to find Imani standing before the gate of the elders' hall. The sun had not yet risen, but the light around her shimmered with silver. A soft wind circled her feet, and the sand shifted with patterns that resembled letters, names, scars. The elders refused to come out. We will not be judged by a girl, Elder Bako shouted from within. This is madness. We are the voice of the ancestors. But outside, the ancestors had gathered. Ghosts and shadows filled the air like dust. Figures with hollow eyes and missing mouths. Women with broken limbs. Men with split skulls. Children with open bellies. They floated around Imani, silent but glowing with memory. And then, Imani opened her mouth. One word. One final name, Bako. The door to the hall exploded inward as if struck by thunder. Elder Bako was thrown across the room. His skin began to split at the seams. From within him brine flowed, more salt than blood. He screamed until the salt filled his lungs and silenced him forever. Elder Kenna tried to run. She grabbed her walking stick, shouted a prayer to the sky, and dashed toward the back of the hall. But the earth had risen. The ground behind the hut was no longer there, only sand carved with a spiral of names. Names she knew. Names she had helped bury. When she tried to scream, her mouth produced no sound. Her voice was gone, stolen by the very silence she had imposed. She sank to her knees and wept, surrounded by spirits as Imani walked past her, unbothered, untouchable. By the end of that day the council hut was empty. Imani stood alone in the center of the village. The people gathered, fearful, humbled. And still she said nothing. But that night, every villager heard a different voice in their dreams. A voice of someone they had lost. Some heard mothers. Some heard brothers. Some heard children. Each voice whispered a single truth. She returned what we buried. From then on, Imani was not called cursed. She was known as the keeper of names. And though she still rarely spoke, when she did, the earth listened. Justice had no longer a voice of thunder. It had the voice of a girl salted into silence, and reborn as truth. She walked with the stillness of a grave, her bare feet silent against the dusted earth as dawn's first light brushed the sky. The village of Busa lay behind her, broken, cracked open like a fruit too ripe with secrets. Names had been spoken. Bones had answered. And now it was time to leave. Imani's small frame moved slowly, not out of weariness but with purpose. Her eyes were deep pools, far older than the body they rested in. Those who dared watch her from their shattered doorways said she no longer walked like a child. They said her shadow moved ahead of her, not behind. Some claimed it was not her at all, that the voice inside her had become something else. She climbed the sacred hill at the edge of Busa where no child had ever been allowed. The baobab tree stood waiting, ancient, gnarled, and hollowed by lightning from storms long past. It was said the tree had been struck 12 times but never fell. Just like the truth. Just like her. When she reached it, the sky trembled. Dark clouds coiled like fists, thick and slow, gathering above her head. But she showed no fear. She sat beneath the tree, her legs folded, her hands resting on her knees like an elder in meditation. Her lips parted slightly but no sound came. Not yet. Below, the villagers gathered in silence, drawn to the hill as if pulled by a string of breath. Even the animals were quiet. The goats did not bleat, the dogs did not bark. Babies in slings slept without stirring. The air had weight, the weight of waiting, of watching, of wondering what she would do next. Then the lightning came. One bolt. Then another. The sky cracked open, jagged with white fire. Each strike carved the sky like a blade across skin, and in their brief flash, names blazed across the heavens in burning letters. Names long buried. Names once silenced. Names that had died with screams in throats or tears in soil. Elders fell to their knees. Mothers gasped. Fathers wept openly, clutching their chests as the names of their victims or their sins or their ancestors lit up the sky like a curse. Imani did not flinch. Her gaze held steady on the horizon, even as fire licked the edge of the tree and the wind howled in spirals around her. And then silence. Not the silence of peace. Not the silence of rest. A silence so complete it echoed in the bones of the earth. When the villagers finally dared to climb the hill, they found only the tree. Blackened but unburned. Stronger than before. Of Imani there was no sign. No footprints. No cloth. No scent. Only the faintest whisper when the wind touched the tree's hollow, a whisper that said, "Speak true or be spoken." From that day forward, everything changed. Children were no longer fed salted food as punishment or control. The elders who survived stepped down quietly one by one, and disappeared into the bush or were found weeping at the edge of the river, begging the water to forget their names. New customs were born. Every newborn was brought to the baobab tree to hear the wind whisper through its trunk. Stories became sacred. Silence became respected, not forced. And truth became a fire none dared smother. Busa rebuilt slowly. But no lie survived long. If someone buried a wrong, it returned, in dreams, in rains, in cracks on their walls. The people said the land itself had become a tongue. That to walk in Busa meant walking among the spoken dead. Imani became legend, but not a tale for children. Her story was not told to frighten, but to remind. She was not called a ghost, nor a witch, nor a saint. She was called the last silence. And under every baobab tree that grew in the years that followed, her name was whispered, not as fear, but as thanks. Because sometimes silence is not absence. Sometimes silence is listening. Sometimes silence is justice.